The morning Eleanor Beaumont walked into the Millhaven social hall wearing her wedding dress 3 days before her actual wedding, she had no idea that a chair, a stranger, and the sound of splintering wood would change the entire course of her life. The year was 1874, and the town of Millhaven, Colorado, sat nestled at the foot of the Rocky Mountains like a coin dropped into a boot, small, overlooked, and always a little off balance. It was a proper frontier town by most accounts, with a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud when the summer rains rolled down from the peaks, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Farlow, who kept her prices high and her opinions higher, a saloon that never quite closed, and a church that never quite filled. Beyond the church and the schoolhouse and the clustered homes of 200 souls, the mountains rose in great gray walls, and somewhere up those slopes, in the silence between the pines, men lived alone with their traps and their axes and their thoughts. Eleanor was 24 years old, and she was large in the way that the frontier made people look smaller by comparison. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and her body was soft and round and full, her hips wide, her arms generous, her face beautiful in the way that heartland women were beautiful, open and honest, and a little weathered around the edges, even in youth. She had dark auburn hair that she pinned up with the patience of someone who had learned that fighting one's nature only led to more work, and her eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain. By Millhaven standards, she was considered too big, too bold, too loud when she laughed, and entirely too much for a decent man to want. She had heard this opinion stated plainly enough, usually by women who smiled while they said it. The man she was to marry was Gerald Holt, a land agent from Denver who had come to Millhaven 6 months ago with good boots and a good suit and very little else of substance. He was thin and neat, and his smiles arrived a half-second too late, like a train that knew it was behind schedule but could not seem to hurry. He had proposed after a month of calling, and Eleanor's mother had wept with relief. And Eleanor had said yes because she was 24 and tired, and because no one else had asked, and because she had told herself that this was simply how love worked, practical and quiet, and built on reasonable foundations. She told herself this with the conviction of someone who did not quite believe it. The social was a gathering held every summer in the Millhaven Social Hall, organized by the women of the church committee, which in practice meant organized by Mrs. Cordelia Farnsworth, who was 60 years old and had strong feelings about bunting. The event marked the end of the season's first hay cutting and was equal parts celebration, gossip, and matchmaking, with long tables of food and a fiddle player named Old Pete, who played the same 7 songs in rotating order and had been doing so for 11 years. For Eleanor, this social was also the occasion of the first public celebration of her coming marriage. There was to be a small toast. Her mother had been planning it since Thursday. Eleanor arrived at the social hall at 4:30 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the gathering was set to begin, because her mother wanted her there early, and her mother's wanting of things had always had the quality of weather, unavoidable and impossible to argue with. She wore the wedding dress because her mother had insisted that people should see it ahead of the ceremony, and because Mrs. Farnsworth had requested it with enough polite pressure that refusal felt impossible. The dress was ivory and proper, and had been let out twice by the seamstress, who had done so without comment, but with the expression of someone making a comment regardless. The hall smelled of pine resin and old wood and the faint ghost of last winter's stove smoke. Long tables had been arranged in rows, each set with mismatched chairs collected from homes across Millhaven, every chair slightly different height and vintage and degree of structural integrity. The chairs at the head table, where Eleanor and Gerald and their families would sit, were the newest and finest available, sourced by Mrs. Farnsworth from her own dining room, which she considered the finest in Millhaven, which was true but not especially impressive. Eleanor's mother, Louise Beaumont, was a small, sharp woman with the energy of a terrier and the conversational style of a runaway cart. She met Eleanor at the door and immediately began adjusting the dress's collar and speaking about the importance of sitting properly and the necessity of not laughing too loudly and several other things that Eleanor had heard so many times they had stopped landing. "The chair at the head of the table," her mother said, guiding her by the elbow, "is the one Mrs. Farnsworth sent over. It belonged to her late husband. It is a perfectly good chair, and you are to sit in it carefully." Eleanor sat in it carefully. She sat in it with all the care that one woman could apply to the act of sitting, which was in fact a great deal of care, careful in the placement of her weight, careful in the angle of her descent, careful in every particular. And the chair made a sound like a gunshot on a quiet morning, a single sharp crack followed by a soft groan. And then the left rear leg buckled with a sideways lurch that sent Eleanor pitching to one side and depositing her onto the plank floor of the social hall in a billow of ivory fabric and a clatter that echoed off every wall. For a moment, the hall was perfectly silent. Her mother stood with both hands pressed to her cheeks. Mrs. Farnsworth, who had been arranging napkins at the far end of the hall, turned with an expression that was carefully constructed not to be what it was. Eleanor sat on the floor in her wedding dress with splinters of Mr. Farnsworth's chair around her like a wreath, and she felt something open up inside her chest, not pain, not anger, not exactly humiliation, but something that had all three of those ingredients, plus a fourth thing that was harder to name, something that had been building for years, the feeling of being too much for the spaces that the world allocated to her. She was not hurt. She had fallen sideways rather than backward, and the floor had received her without cruelty. But she was down, and her dress was down with her, and the chair lay in 4 pieces, and her mother was making a sound somewhere between speech and disaster, and Mrs. Farnsworth was approaching with the measured pace of someone preparing a verdict. And every instinct Eleanor had told her that the next 5 minutes would be the subject of conversation in Millhaven for the next 5 years. She was trying to stand, which was difficult in the dress and more difficult with her mother fluttering at her sides in a way that was meant to help, but primarily prevented leverage, when the door to the social hall opened and light poured in from the late afternoon sun, and the man came inside. He had to turn sideways to fit through the doorframe, not because he was dramatically wide, though he was wide, but because he carried a double-bit axe over one shoulder and a canvas sack over the other, and the combined width of the man plus tools was simply more than the frame had accounted for. He was perhaps 6 feet and 3 inches of solid constructed muscle, the kind of muscle that comes not from vanity, but from work, from splitting cords of timber and hauling elk and climbing slopes in deep snow and doing all of this year after year until the body becomes a thing primarily defined by its capability rather than its appearance. He wore canvas trousers and a worn flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were the forearms of a man who had earned them honestly. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in a way that suggested it had last been cut whenever he had last been in town, which appeared to have been some time ago. He had a jaw that looked like it had been quarried from the same rock as the mountains behind the town, a week's beard, and eyes that were a very direct shade of dark amber, the color of pine sap in late light. He looked at the woman on the floor. He looked at the broken chair. He looked around the hall with the calm assessment of a man who spent most of his time reading terrain, and he did not make any of the faces that the other people in the room had made. "Are you hurt?" he said, and his voice was low and even and came from somewhere down in his chest. "No," Eleanor said. "I am not hurt. I am simply on the floor." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was the country that bordered on one. He set down the axe with a care that suggested he was always careful with tools, and he set down the canvas sack, and he crossed the hall in 4 steps and crouched in front of her with a naturalness that suggested he found nothing unusual about this situation at all. "Can you get your feet under you if I give you something to hold on to?" he asked. "I expect I can," she said. He offered his hand, and it was the hand of a man who had spent his life working, broad and calloused and thoroughly capable, and Eleanor took it, and he rose from his crouch steadily, pulling her up with a control and a strength that made it feel not like being hauled, but like being lifted, as though the act of rising were simply a collaboration between 2 people of good faith. She was on her feet. The dress settled around her. She released his hand. "Thank you," she said. "The chair broke under me too," he said, as though this were simply a piece of relevant information, and he said it loud enough that it carried in the hall, which Eleanor understood immediately was intentional. Mrs. Farnsworth stopped with her mouth open. "It was old wood," he continued, moving to crouch over the broken pieces with a focused expression, turning them over in his big hands and examining the joints and the grain. The mortise joint had dried out, probably been working loose for a season or two, has nothing to do with who was sitting in it. He looked up at Mrs. Farnsworth with the directness of a man who did not use social cushioning. Chair like this breaks for any number of people. You should not have used it for a gathering. Mrs. Farnsworth straightened. I was not aware. Now you are, he said, not unkindly but without apology, and he turned the pieces over again. I can fix it. Have it done before the gathering starts if you have some white oak glue and a clamp, which I doubt you have, or I can use what I've got in my kit. You carry wood repair supplies? Eleanor's mother said, with the tone of a woman recalibrating. I carry what I need, he said simply. His name, as was eventually established during the organized chaos of the next 20 minutes, was Callum Reeve. He was 30 years old, and he had lived in the mountains above Millhaven for going on 4 years, coming down twice or 3 times a year to trade pelts and purchase supplies, and occasionally have a wound attended to by Doc Halverson, who had given up asking where and how, and simply treated whatever Callum arrived with. He was not precisely from Millhaven, and not precisely from anywhere, in the way that mountain men tended to exist outside the fixed geography of belonging. He had grown up in Missouri, had come west with a surveying crew at 22, had drifted higher after the survey was complete, and had found that the mountains suited him in a way that flat country never had. He was, in the language of Millhaven, a bit wild. He was also, in the language that Eleanor was beginning to speak internally and without permission, the most compellingly alive person she had seen in a very long time. He worked on the chair with his kit, which turned out to contain a remarkable assortment of things that folded and clicked and had their own designated places in worn leather pockets. He cleaned the broken tenon of the rear leg, recut the joint with a small chisel that he sharpened first on a whetstone he produced from his shirt pocket, applied a carpenter's glue from a small clay pot he kept, stoppered in the kit, reassembled the joint with the practiced efficiency of a man who fixed things because he had to and had long since gotten good at it. He set a small, improvised clamp from a length of cord and 2 wedges and declared the joint would set within the hour if left alone. Then, while Eleanor and her mother watched and Mrs. Farnsworth stood to one side with an expression of somewhat reluctant gratitude, Callum Reeve moved the repaired chair to one side, placed it carefully out of the main traffic of the hall, sat down in it himself, and folded his arms. What are you doing? Mrs. Farnsworth said. Testing it, he said. If the joint fails under me, it fails before anyone else sits in it. He outweighed Eleanor by a considerable margin. The chair held. He sat in it for 10 minutes while the hall filled up around him, sitting with the patience of a man accustomed to stillness, and the chair held. He stood up eventually and said, It will hold, and moved the chair back to its place at the head table. Eleanor watched all of this from across the room, where she had gone to help with the setting out of food, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because standing still in a wedding dress in the middle of a hall where everyone was now aware of what had happened was not something she found bearable. She watched Callum Reeve sit in that chair, and she felt something stir in her chest that was distinct from gratitude and distinct from admiration, and was actually something that made her somewhat annoyed at herself, given that she was 3 days from marrying Gerald Holt. The gathering filled up as Colorado summer evenings filled up, quickly and warmly, and with a great deal of movement. People arrived in their good clothes and with their good manners deployed at half power, the way that small towns had of being formal enough to mean something and relaxed enough to be real. Old Pete sat up in the corner with his fiddle and began with the first of his 7 songs, which was a reel that no one needed to hear introduced. Long tables filled with dishes, roasted chicken and corn pudding and pickled beets and fresh bread and 3 separate pies and a quantity of lemonade that had been sweetened past the point of virtue. The hall smelled wonderful. The lanterns threw warm amber light over everything. Gerald Holt arrived at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hands and a smile that arrived at the correct time for once, and he found Eleanor near the food table and kissed her cheek with a proprietorial affection that she received without particular warmth, which she told herself was simply how she was. I heard about the chair, Gerald said. Mother said you made quite a scene. I did not make a scene, Eleanor said. A chair broke. Well, Gerald said with a smoothing gesture that was his standard response to friction, no harm done. You look fine. She looked fine. She watched Callum Reeve from across the room. He had not dressed for the social in any way. He was still in his working clothes, but he moved through the gathering with a composure that suggested he was perfectly comfortable in his own appearance, which Eleanor found simultaneously irritating and deeply admirable. He was eating with the focused appreciation of a man who did not often have access to fresh-cooked food, and she found that she could not stop noticing him, the sheer physical presence of him, the way the room organized itself slightly around where he stood, the way he listened when people spoke to him with his full attention, the way he laughed, which was real and sudden and arrived without the half-second delay she had learned to look for. She looked away. She smiled at Gerald. She answered questions about the wedding from women who asked them with varying degrees of genuine interest. She was engaged to be married in 3 days, and the gathering was in her honor, and she was going to be happy about it. Old Pete played his second song. The trouble started, as trouble in Millhaven tended to start, with Heck Dunmore. Heck Dunmore was 42 years old and ran the largest ranch in the valley and had opinions about everything and the social standing to inflict those opinions freely. He had been drinking since before the gathering and had arrived at the hall in the elevated condition of a man who has decided that the truth is his to tell. He was not a mean man exactly, but he was a careless one, and carelessness in a man of his size and standing had effects that spread outward in uncomfortable ways. He found Callum Reeve near the water barrel and clapped him on the shoulder with the force of someone who mistakes force for friendliness. "Callum Reeve, you are still haunting these mountains like a ghost," Heck said with a broad grin. "What brings you down from your cave?" "Trading," Callum said. "Stay for winter this time," Heck said. "A man wants to be among people." "Some men," Callum said. Heck laughed and moved on, because Heck moved on from everything, and he moved on toward the food table and toward Eleanor, and he refreshed his lemonade and looked at Eleanor with the particular look of a man who was about to say something that would be delivered as a compliment and land as anything but. "Miss Beaumont," he said. "Or nearly Mrs. Holt, I should say. You look lovely in that dress. They certainly made enough of it." He laughed. His wife, standing nearby, closed her eyes briefly. Eleanor smiled the smile she had developed over 24 years for exactly this category of remark. "Thank you, Mr. Dunmore." "No, truly," Heck said, warming to himself. "It's an achievement is what it is. Cordelia, you must have used a bolt and a half of fabric on that thing." Mrs. Farnsworth was not anywhere near the food table, but this fact did not register with Heck. "I think," said a voice from immediately behind Eleanor, "that the dress is very fine." She turned. Callum Reeve had moved quietly and without any announcement from where he had been standing by the water barrel to a position approximately 2 feet behind her right shoulder, and he was looking at Heck Dunmore with the amber eyes and the calm of a mountain ridge in still weather. Heck blinked. "Well, sure, Callum, sure it is. I was just saying—" "I know what you were saying," Callum said. He was not raising his voice. He did not need to. The voice he had was the kind that carried by its own quality without any amplification. "I expect Miss Beaumont has heard versions of it before and does not need it tonight." Heck's face worked through several expressions. He settled on a sort of bluff self-deprecation. No offense meant. "Then none needs to be offered," Callum said. Heck Dunmore moved away from the food table with the velocity of a man who had somewhere else to be. His wife caught Eleanor's eye over his departing shoulder and gave her the briefest nod which contained more sympathy and solidarity than many long speeches. Eleanor turned to Callum. "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "I can handle Heck Dunmore myself." "I know that too," he said. "I didn't do it because you couldn't. I did it because you shouldn't have to." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back with the directness he brought to everything, and there was nothing uncomfortable or presumptuous in it, just a very clear attention that was somehow both impersonal and completely personal. "I don't know your name," he said. "Eleanor Beaumont." "I know you're the bride," he said. "Callum Reeve." "I know," she said. "You fixed the chair." "It needed fixing," he said. Old Pete had moved to his third song, which was a waltz, slow and slightly off-tempo in the way that Pete's waltzes always were, like a river that knew the shape of the dance but was doing it in its own good time. A few couples moved to the center of the hall. "Do you dance?" Eleanor asked, and then immediately felt the question arrive wrong, too forward, too curious, and she straightened and said, "Not that I'm asking, I only meant, I don't dance particularly well," Callum said, "but I can follow a 3 count if you wanted to." She should not have wanted to. She was 3 days from marrying Gerald Holt, who was somewhere near the Lemonade, and appeared to be in conversation with a man about land prices, and had not, she noticed, asked her to dance. "All right," Eleanor said. They danced. It was a simple matter of 2 people moving in the same direction in the correct time, but it was a simple matter that occupied her entire attention in a way she could not account for. He was a careful dancer, as he seemed to be a careful person, aware of his size and its potential for accident, moving with a deliberateness that gave her room and kept her steady. His hand at her waist was warm through the ivory fabric, and he held her at the proper distance and looked over her shoulder rather than at her face, which somehow made her more aware of his face than if he had been staring directly at her. "You have been in these mountains 4 years, she said, because silence seemed dangerous. "Closer to 5 now," he said. "Do you not get lonely?" He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to all questions. "Sometimes in the long part of winter, late February, everything buried and no movement anywhere. That is the loneliest it gets." "And the rest of the time?" "The rest of the time there's enough to do that loneliness doesn't find a foothold." The waltz continued. Pete was on his 3rd repetition of the melody, which was generous. "What made you come down today?" Eleanor asked. "I had pelts to trade, and I needed flour and salt and a new file for my saw." He paused. "I did not expect to be at a social." "Are you glad you came?" There was a longer pause. He was looking over her shoulder at the far wall. "I think so," he said. Gerald appeared at the edge of the dancing couples with his hat in his hands and a smile that had slipped off center. "Eleanor," he said, "I think your mother wants you." Eleanor's mother was nowhere visible to want anything, but Eleanor stepped back from Callum with a composure she had to construct from several different parts of herself. "Thank you for the dance," she said. "Thank you for asking," Callum said. She went to her mother, who was in fact talking to Mrs. Anderson about a recipe and wanted nothing in particular, and Eleanor stood beside her and nodded at things and felt the evening continue around her, and tried very hard not to be aware of exactly where in the hall Callum Reeve was standing at any given moment. She was not very successful at this. The toast happened at 7:30, Gerald's hand at the small of her back, his voice warm and practiced as he thanked the people of Millhaven for their support of his and Eleanor's upcoming union. He said the right things. He said them smoothly. Eleanor smiled and held her glass of lemonade and thought about the feeling of a waltz with a man who moved carefully and said what he thought and had sat in a broken chair to make sure it would hold. She told herself to stop thinking about it. She was mostly unsuccessful at this too. The gathering wound down at 9 when old Pete ran out of energy for his 7th song and simply stopped mid-verse, which was also his usual conclusion. People collected their dishes and their children and their good manners and filtered out into the Colorado night, which was cool now and smelled of pine and distance. The lanterns inside the hall were being extinguished one by one. Eleanor was helping stack chairs, carefully this time, testing each one before trusting it with anything, when she became aware that Callum was also still in the hall, helping old Pete break down his stand and carry the pieces to Pete's wagon with the efficient helpfulness that seemed to be simply how he existed in the world. Gerald had already left. He had work in the morning, he had explained, and had kissed her cheek again and been precise about the logistics of seeing her the following afternoon, and then departed with his good boots and his correct manners, and Eleanor had watched him go with the feeling of someone watching a clock that worked perfectly and told only the time. Pete left. Mrs. Farnsworth left with a stiffness that contained within it a thank you it was not quite ready to deliver verbally. Eleanor's mother left with a series of specific instructions about locking the hall, which Eleanor accepted. The hall was nearly empty. Callum was loading the last of the food table linens into a box near the door because someone had to, and he was there. Eleanor was carrying the box of good napkins to the shelf near the kitchen door. They were the only two people left. "Where are you staying tonight?" Eleanor asked, because the question of a man who lived in the mountains coming down to a town social was practical in a way that felt safe to address. "McAuliffe's barn," he said. "He lets me use the loft when I'm in town. It is a long ride up the mountain in the dark." "It is," he agreed. She set the box on the shelf. She turned around. He was standing near the doorway with his axe and his canvas kit, and the last lantern was making amber light across the whole hall, and she was suddenly and acutely aware that she was 3 days from marrying Gerald Holt. "Mr. Reeve," she said. "Callum," he said. "Callum." She paused. "Thank you, for the chair, and for what you said to Heck Dunmore, and for the dance." "You're welcome for all of them," he said. She nodded. She looked at the floor. She looked up. "I should lock up," she said. "Right," he said. He picked up his kit. He went to the door and held it open for her with the courtesy of a man who had been raised to do this and had not unlearned it in the mountains. She locked the door. He stood on the step beside her while she did it, and then she tucked the key into her dress pocket and they stood in the Colorado night. Together for a moment, the stars above the mountains in numbers that town light never quite showed, the air cool and carrying the smell of pine and a distant creek. "Good evening, Eleanor Beaumont," he said. "Good evening, Callum Reeve," she said. He walked toward McAuliffe's barn. She walked toward her mother's house. She did not look back, because she was determined and practical and almost married, but she heard his footsteps on the dirt road and noted the exact moment when they turned and faded and were gone. She slept poorly that night. The following morning was ordinary in its requirements. Breakfast, helping her mother with the last-minute preparations for the wedding, a fitting appointment with the seamstress about a minor issue with the dress's hem, and extraordinary in its effect, because Eleanor found herself carrying on conversations while inside she was having a different conversation entirely. The inside conversation was the kind she preferred not to have, the kind that asked uncomfortable questions and refused to accept social conventions as answers. She walked past the general store and thought nothing of it, and then turned back because she needed salt for her mother's pantry, which was true. Mrs. Farlow's store was cool and smelled of dried goods and had a wooden floor that creaked in a specific pattern that Eleanor had known since childhood. Callum Reeve was at the counter when she came in, buying flour and salt and nails and the file for his saw that he had mentioned, and he turned when the door opened with the alertness of a man who always knew when something changed in a space, and he saw her, and the expression on his face was one she had not yet catalogued but immediately recognized as significant. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and went to find the salt with the focused energy of a woman who had a reason to be there and was sticking to it. Mrs. Farlow watched them both with the interest of a woman who had been selling goods in a small town for 30 years and had learned to read the room the way other people read newspapers. Eleanor paid for her salt. Callum was finishing his transaction and tucking things into his canvas kit with practiced efficiency. She should leave. She was going to leave. "I'm heading up the mountain today," he said, not to her in particular, but in the way of a man stating the weather. "Need to be back before the first snow, which gives me about 2 months. "That is soon," she said. "It is," he said. "And then you are up there until spring," she said. "Usually February or March, depending on the passes." He straightened and shouldered the kit. He looked at her directly, the way he always seemed to look at things, without decoration or evasion. "Congratulations on your upcoming wedding, Miss Beaumont." Something happened in her chest that she could not afford to examine. "Thank you, Mr. Reeve." He touched the brim of his hat, which he had not been wearing at the social, but was wearing now, a battered felt thing with a crease that spoke of years of use, and he went out the door. Eleanor stood at Mrs. Farlow's counter holding her salt. "That man," said Mrs. Farlow, after a suitable pause, "has not looked at anyone in Millhaven in 5 years the way he just looked at you." "You're imagining things, Mrs. Farlow," Eleanor said. "I am certainly not," said Mrs. Farlow, with the serenity of someone who is right and knows it. Eleanor went home. She helped her mother with the wedding preparations. She pressed the dress. She polished her shoes. She had dinner with Gerald and his mother at their rented house, and Gerald's mother was a thin, precise woman who talked about Denver and the life they would have there when Gerald's business was established. And Eleanor listened and nodded and thought about what it meant to spend 50 years beside someone, and whether the ability to be honest with that person was a luxury or a necessity. She went home and sat by the window and looked at the mountains in the dark for a long time. The following morning she woke up certain. The certainty was uncomfortable. It sat in her chest like a stone that had always been there, but had only now made its weight fully known. She lay in her narrow bed in her mother's house, listening to the birds beginning their racket in the cottonwoods outside, and she thought very carefully and honestly about Gerald Holt, and about her life in Denver, and about the half-second delay in Gerald's smiles, and about a man who had sat in a broken chair to test whether it would hold. She thought about what it felt like to be looked at without decoration or evasion. She thought about what it felt like to be defended without being asked. She thought about a waltz that had been only a waltz and had somehow occupied more of her internal space than 6 months of courtship. She got up. She made herself breakfast, because whatever happened, this was not a reason to skip meals, and her mother was still sleeping. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, which was strong and practical and hot, and she made the list that honest people make when they are facing themselves plainly, the list of what is real and what is only what one hopes is real. What was real? She did not love Gerald Holt. She had never loved Gerald Holt. She had wanted to love him, had tried to want to love him, had told herself and others a story about practical foundations and reasonable expectations, and the story had been held together by nothing but the habit of telling it. What was real? She had danced with a man for 7 minutes and felt more seen and more herself than she had in 6 months of formal courtship. What was real? Callum Reeve was riding up that mountain today. She was in her good day dress and her practical boots, and she was out the door before she had finished the argument with herself, which was also not unusual for her, because Eleanor Beaumont was a woman who, when she finally made up her mind, made it up with her whole body. She did not go to find Callum first. She went to Gerald. Gerald was at his rented office, which smelled of paper and the faint ghost of ambition, and he looked up from his desk with a mild surprise that did not involve any particular alarm, which told her something. "Eleanor," he said, "you're early." "Gerald," she said, "I cannot marry you." The mild surprise expanded. He set down his pen. He was quiet for a moment with the quiet of a man processing information. "Has something happened?" "Something has always been happening," she said, "and I have been pretending it hasn't. I'm sorry, Gerald, truly. You are a decent man, and I have wasted your time by not being honest sooner about the fact that I do not love you, not in the way that a woman ought to love the man she is marrying." Gerald looked at her with his neat and careful face, and she waited for anger or grief, and what arrived instead was something that looked, she realized slowly, like relief. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I've been wondering for some time whether I was simply a practical option for you. I did not want to say so because I was not entirely sure of my own feelings either, and it seemed," he paused, "it seemed easier not to say so." She sat down in the chair across his desk. They looked at each other with the calm of two people who have been circling a truth and have finally stopped circling. "Are you in love with someone else?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. I don't know what I am. But I know I am not what you need either, and it is not fair to both of us to continue." "Your mother is going to be furious," Gerald said. "My mother is going to be volcanic," Eleanor agreed. Something in his face moved toward the real smile, the one that had no delay. "I am sorry too," he said, "for the same reasons." She stood up. "I think you will find someone who suits you properly, Gerald, someone who is happy in Denver." "I think you will find someone who suits you properly too," he said, "though I suspect that person lives somewhat higher in altitude than I ever planned to." She left his office without answering that, because there was no honest answer she was prepared to give yet. Her mother was indeed volcanic. The conversation happened in the kitchen and lasted 45 minutes and covered every emotional register from grief to accusation to the specific variety of maternal fury that carries within it a question not quite asked about whether the recipient of this fury has considered the impact on the person delivering it. Eleanor heard all of it with the patience of someone who loved the person delivering it and understood that the anger was largely fear on her behalf. "You are 24 years old," her mother said. "I know, Mama. You may not find another offer. I know that too. What will you do? What will people say?" "I do not know what I will do," Eleanor said, "but I know that doing the wrong thing for the sake of having a thing done is not wisdom. It is only tidiness." Her mother sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. The fight went out of her like air from a bellows. She looked suddenly older and more tired and more honest. "You have never been able to do anything by halves," her mother said. "Not since you were small." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Is there someone else?" her mother asked, with the particular quiet of a mother who already suspects the answer. "There is no one," Eleanor said, and this was true enough for the purposes of this conversation. "There is only the fact that I should not marry a man I do not love." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have agreed with you," which was the closest thing to approval that Louise Beaumont had ever managed without going all the way. Eleanor went home through the main street of Millhaven, past the general store and the saloon and the church and the hall, where last night the chairs had been restored to their homes, and she was aware of the looks that were already following her, because news in Millhaven moved on its own schedule, and that schedule was fast. She did not flinch at the looks. She walked with her head up and her spine straight, in the way that a woman who has been too much for most spaces learns to carry herself, not with defiance exactly, but with the settled quality of someone who has made peace with occupying the space she is in. She walked to McAuliffe's barn. The loft was empty. His horse was gone from the stall. He had already left. She stood in McAuliffe's barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, and she thought about a man riding up into those mountains, and about February being the loneliest time, and about white oak glue, and a repaired chair, and the amber color of his eyes in lantern light. She was not, she told herself, walking home, going to chase a mountain man up a mountain. She was not that kind of woman. She was a practical and determined and fundamentally sensible woman who had just made an enormous social and personal disruption based on 7 minutes of dancing and a waltz that Pete had played slightly off-tempo, and she was going to go home and be sensible about it and see what happened. What happened over the next 3 weeks was the following. Millhaven processed the broken engagement with the thoroughness it gave to all significant events. There were opinions. There were the opinions of women who had always thought Eleanor too much and found her decision proof of this. There were the opinions of women who had always suspected Gerald Holt was the wrong man and found her decision proof of that. There was Mrs. Farlow, who said nothing but handed Eleanor her goods each time she came in with the particular care of someone who approved. There were 2 pieces of work that Eleanor was politely not offered anymore because the people offering them were Gerald's business contacts or allies of Mrs. Farnsworth, and there was 1 new piece of work that came from Heck Dunmore's wife, who wanted her household accounts organized, which Eleanor suspected was less about the accounts and more about a quiet act of solidarity. There was also, 3 weeks after the social, a knock on the door of her mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon, and when Eleanor opened it, Callum Reeve was on the step. He was wearing the same canvas trousers and a different flannel shirt, clean this time, and he had his hat in his hands. He had apparently made some effort to organize his hair, with limited success. He looked very large and very deliberate, and slightly uncertain in the way of a man who has prepared what he wants to say, and is not entirely sure how it will land. "I heard in town," he said, "about the engagement." "The whole town heard," Eleanor said. "I came down to trade, but—" He paused with the honesty of a man who did not want to hide behind convenience. "That's not why I came to your door." She looked at him. He looked back. The afternoon light was doing things to the color of his eyes that she had been trying not to think about for 3 weeks. "Would you like to come in?" she said. "I would," he said. Her mother was visiting Mrs. Anderson, and the house was quiet, and Eleanor made coffee because this was what you did, and because her hands needed something to do, and Callum sat at the kitchen table, which was, she noted, perfectly solid and gave no indication of structural difficulty. He sat with the careful stillness he brought to everything, hat on the table, large hands folded in front of him. "I have been thinking about you," he said, with the directness that was simply his manner of speaking, without prelude or prettying up. "Since the social, I want to be honest with you about that." "I've been thinking about you too," she said, and felt the saying of it like something releasing. "I don't know what I can offer you," he said. "I live up a mountain. I come down twice a year. It is not a life that most women want." "Have you asked most women?" "No," he said. "I have not been in the habit of asking." She brought the coffee to the table and sat across from him. He was even larger in the kitchen than he had been in the hall, filling the chair and the space around it with the kind of presence that was not intimidating so much as simply very there, like a good fire on a cold evening. "Why did you come down today?" she said. "Truly?" He looked at his hands. He looked up at her. "Because I spent 3 weeks trying to talk myself out of coming and couldn't manage it," he said. "And because I thought if I didn't come and say what I have to say, I would be up that mountain in February thinking about it. And February is hard enough without that." Something in her chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or practicality or anything her mother had ever told her about men and marriage. "What is it you have to say?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "That I think you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time," he said. "And that when you were on that floor in that dress and you looked up with that expression, not embarrassed, not undone, just very present in the situation, I thought that was the most interesting and real thing I had seen in years. And I thought about it for 3 weeks. And now I am here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow was making a fuss in the cottonwoods. "You came to tell me that I was interesting when I fell off a chair," she said. Something in his face moved toward the real smile, the one she had first seen a trace of in the hall. "I came to tell you that you were the most interesting person in that room," he said. "The chair was incidental." She laughed. It was the real laugh, the loud one, the one that her mother had spent years moderating, and it came out fully and freely, and she watched his face when it did, and what she saw there settled something she had not known was unsettled. "I do not know anything about living on a mountain," she said. "I know how to teach things," he said. "I am not easy to live with, probably," she said. "I have opinions." "I noticed," he said. "I found it refreshing." She looked at him across the kitchen table in her mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon, with the autumn beginning to turn the cottonwoods outside, and the coffee cooling in the cups and the mountains visible through the window above the sink, and she thought about all the things she was and all the spaces that had never quite been the right size for her. "Tell me about the mountain," she said. So he told her. He told her about the cabin he had built over 2 winters, which was made of pine logs and had a proper stone fireplace and a loft and a covered porch that looked down the valley. He told her about the spring that ran behind it, good cold water year-round. He told her about the elk and the mule deer and the way the aspens turned in October, gold and trembling, the most extravagant thing he had seen in nature. He told her about the winters, honestly, the depth of the snow, the cold that settled in by December and did not lift until March, the stretches of days when you could not go far from the cabin and the world shrank to the size of your walls and your fire. He told her about the loneliness in late February with the matter-of-fact honesty of a man who did not want to oversell his situation. She listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. "It sounds like freedom," she said. "It is," he said. "And it sounds like loneliness, too." "Those are often the same thing," she said. He looked at her across the table with the amber eyes and the full attention he brought to things that mattered to him, and she understood in that moment that she was one of those things, and the understanding was both vertiginous and completely right. "Would you walk with me?" he said. "This afternoon. Just walk. I would like to know more about you." "Yes," she said. They walked along the creek road that ran north of Millhaven, between the willows and the cottonwoods, with the mountains on their right hand, and the flat of the valley stretching left toward the flat country and the wide world. They talked. They talked the way 2 people who have been waiting to talk to the right person talk, with speed and depth and the constant minor surprise of recognition, the finding of a thought or a feeling in the other person that one had believed privately held. Eleanor told him about growing up in Millhaven, about her father who had died of fever when she was 9, and left her mother sharp with grief that had never quite resolved into something softer. She told him about her love of reading and the difficulty of finding good books in a town of 200, She told him about the feeling of being too large for Millhaven's expectations, not in her body specifically, but in her whole self, her opinions and her laughter and her directness, all the things that had been consistently communicated to her as too much. He listened without telling her she was wrong to feel it, which was rarer than it should have been. He told her about Missouri and his father, who had been a furniture maker, and from whom he had learned the use of tools, the love of working wood, the satisfaction of a joint made clean and true. He told her about the survey crew and the mountains, and the first winter he had spent above the tree line, which had nearly killed him, and had also been, he said quietly, the experience that had made him most understand what he was. He told her about the silence of the high peaks and why it did not feel like emptiness, but like a fullness of a different kind, and she understood him perfectly, because the feeling he was describing was the same feeling she got from a book that was exactly right. They walked for 2 hours. The light moved through the afternoon and began its lean toward evening. They stood at the gate where the creek road met the main track back to town, and the light was the particular gold of early autumn in the mountains, which is the most beautiful light there is, and Eleanor felt the weight of the day, the morning's decision, the conversation with her mother, the 3 weeks of processing, and now this walk, this man, this light. She felt it all settle into something that was not resolution yet, but was the shape of resolution. I should go back, she said. I'm in Millhaven another 2 days for trading, he said. Come for dinner tomorrow, she said. My mother cooks well when she decides to. Do you think she'll decide to? He said. She will if I ask her properly, Eleanor said. And if I tell her the truth about who you are, she will want to judge for herself, and no one who has met you properly has found you wanting. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the amber eyes and the full attention, and something in his expression that she had not seen before, something that was softer and more careful than his usual directness. Eleanor, he said, I know this is very fast. It is very fast, she agreed. I don't want to be something that complicates your life further after what you have just been through, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. She looked at him. The golden light was on his face, and his dark hair and his shoulders that were the shoulders of a man who carried things and did not complain about it. And she thought about what honest attention felt like and what it meant to have it directed at her without qualification or apology. You are not complicating my life, she said. You are clarifying it. He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded, once, with the gravity he brought to important things, and that nod meant more to her than most speeches. I will come to dinner tomorrow, he said. He came to dinner. Her mother had, as predicted, decided to cook properly once Eleanor had explained who Callum Reeve was, and what he had done at the social, and what he had said to Heck Dunmore in the conversation in the kitchen and the walk along the creek road. Louise Beaumont's reaction to all of this was to make a roast chicken with herb dressing and cornbread and a dried apple pie, which was her full culinary expression of serious intent. Callum sat at the table in the Beaumont kitchen and ate with the genuine appreciation of a man for whom a good home-cooked meal was a significant event, and he answered Louise Beaumont's questions with the straightforward honesty that Eleanor had already learned was simply how he spoke to everyone, and he complimented the chicken without exaggeration, and he told Louise about the cabin and the mountain with the same frank inventory he had given Eleanor, not selling it, but also not apologizing for it. And by the end of the meal, Louise was passing him a second piece of pie with the expression of a woman who has made a private assessment and is not yet going to announce the result, but has reached one. After dinner, while Eleanor was washing dishes and Callum was drying them because he had simply picked up a cloth and started doing it, Louise sat in the kitchen with her coffee and said, I suppose the mountains are very beautiful. They are, Callum said. Eleanor has always loved beautiful things, her mother said, with an apparent non sequitur that was not one at all. Eleanor did not say anything. She handed him a plate to dry. He stayed for 2 hours. He and Eleanor sat on the porch after the dishes were done, while Louise made a show of reading inside, and the night came down with its stars and its mountain chill, and they talked in the way they had found, deep and easy and full of the small surprises of recognition. He told her more about the cabin. She asked the practical questions, which he answered with respect for the asking, not simplifying or reassuring past the truth. The winters were genuinely hard. The isolation was genuinely real. The work was constant. And it was also genuinely beautiful in a way that was not available in town, and the freedom of it was the kind that cost something and was therefore worth something. "I am not asking you anything," he said at one point carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I'm simply telling you the truth of what I have." "I know," she said. "I'm asking myself." He left at 8 o'clock with the hat and the directness and the careful step of a man carrying something fragile that he did not want to damage. She stood on the porch after he was gone and watched the dark between the cottonwoods where he had disappeared, and then she went inside and told her mother she was going to sleep, which she did not for quite some time. He had one more day of trading. She found him in the afternoon at the farrier's, where he was having his horse's shoes checked before the mountain road, and they walked again, shorter this time, along the main street in the full view of Millhaven, which had been watching all of this with the absorbed interest of a town that had the good luck to be witnessing something worth watching. "I leave tomorrow morning," he said. "I know," she said. "I will come back down in November, weather permitting," he said. "Mid-November if the passes are open." She looked at him. He looked at her. The street around them had the late afternoon activity of a working town, horses and wagons, and the sound of the smithy and children running some errand at speed, and none of it touched the specific quality of the space between them. "Come back," she said. "I intend to," he said. He was gone the next morning. She knew because she was awake at first light, and she heard, or imagined she heard, the sound of a horse on the road north of town, climbing. She lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the shape of things that were still becoming. The autumn went on with the particular beauty of Colorado fall, which does not apologize for its excess. The aspens on the lower slopes turned gold, and then released their leaves in sheets that covered the roads and the meadows, and the mornings got cold enough to make breath visible, and Eleanor worked and read, and helped her mother and helped Mrs. Dunmore with her household accounts, and received the slow renormalization of Millhaven's opinion, which was happening on its own schedule, and which she mostly left alone. She wrote letters. Callum had told her that the trader who came through from the high country twice in autumn could carry letters up to his cabin, and she had written one, a careful letter that was honest without being presumptuous, that told him about the aspens, and about a book she had been reading, and about her mother's improving mood, and about the way Millhaven was settling back into its usual shapes around the disruption of the broken engagement. She told him that she thought about the walks often. She did not tell him some things she thought about often, because the letter was the first one, and there's an order to honesty that respects its own pace. His reply came back with the trader in late October, written on good paper in a hand that was plain and clean and exactly what she would have expected, deliberate, considered, with no wasted words. He told her about the first snow, which had come early and heavily and had kept him inside for 4 days, during which he had repaired a dozen things that had needed repairing and had read her letter more than once. He told her that the aspens had already gone by the time he returned to the mountain, and he had missed the turning, which he said he was somewhat minded to blame on Millhaven for keeping him down so late in the season. He said he intended to make the mid-November descent if the weather held. She read this letter in the kitchen with her coffee, and she felt the mountain cold in the paper, and she thought about a man reading her letter more than once in a cabin in the snow, and she had to set it down for a moment and look at the mountains through the window. The weather held. He came down on the 15th of November, a Thursday, arriving in the late afternoon with his horse loaded with season's pelts and his face darker from the mountain wind, and he came to her door before he went to trade, and he stood on the step with the hat and the canvas kit and the amber eyes, and said, "I am back." "I can see that," she said, and she was smiling before she had finished saying it, the real smile, the full one. He stayed a week this time. He traded on the first day and spent the remaining days in Millhaven in a way that was different from his usual pattern, in the way of a man who has a reason to stay rather than a list to complete. He came to dinner 3 times. He walked with Eleanor every afternoon. He met old Pete at the saloon and played cards with a seriousness that Pete found hilarious and the other men found respectful. He helped McAuliffe with a fence repair on a morning that offered the work, because he was constitutionally incapable of seeing necessary work undone. He and Eleanor went one afternoon to the bookshop in Halford, the next town over, which had a better selection than anything Millhaven offered, and they spent an hour among the shelves, and he turned out to have opinions about books that surprised her with their specificity and depth, and she found several things to argue with him about, and the arguing was the most energetic and happy conversation she could remember having. On the fourth day of his visit, they were sitting on a bench near the creek in the late afternoon, the cottonwoods bare now and the light winter thin and beautiful, and he turned to her with the deliberate quality of a man who has been thinking and has decided to speak. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Come up the mountain with me," he said, "in the spring when the pass is open. Come and see it. See the cabin in the country and what it is actually like, and then tell me what you think." "You are inviting me to visit," she said. "I'm asking you to see whether it is something you could want," he said, with the honest precision that was his way of saying what he meant without stepping past what he had the right to say. "I'm not asking anything beyond that. I want you to see it truly before you decide anything about it." She looked at the bare cottonwoods and the winter creek and the mountains beyond, already deep in snow from the tree line up. "Yes," she said, "I will come in the spring." Something in his face changed in the way of a man who had been holding his breath without knowing it, and had let it go. The winter passed. Eleanor passed it reading and working and writing letters that went up with the occasional trader, and receiving letters that came back in the same slow relay, and the letters grew over the winter months, longer, richer, deeper in the way of correspondence between two people who were using the distance and the deliberateness of writing to say things they might have taken longer to say face to face. She told him things about herself that she had not told people she had known all her life, the way writing sometimes allows a directness that speech withholds. He told her things in return, about his father and the workshop smell of sawdust, about the particular quality of grief that comes from a life without enough tethering, about what he had wanted when he went to the mountains and what he had found and how they were not exactly the same thing. February came. He wrote about it from inside it, the long gray days, the cold that went below what a thermometer could be said to be measuring meaningfully, the silence that was immense and complete, the particular way the cabin felt in that month, both refuge and confinement. He wrote, "I understand now why I told you February was the hardest. It has been harder this year than before, for reasons I think you know." She read this by her mother's fire on a February evening and felt the warmth of it despite the cold it described. She wrote back, "The aspens will be gold again before you know it." He wrote back, "I am counting on it." March arrived with its grudging thaw, slow and unreliable at first, with false springs and returning cold and the mud that made every road a commitment. April was better. By the 1st of May, Eleanor had her small packed bag and her practical clothes and her mother's careful blessing, genuinely given this time, won over by a winter of letters and 3 visits and the evidence of a man who was exactly what he presented himself to be, and she rode north with the trader who made the spring run. The ride up into the mountains was the most beautiful thing she had seen. She had looked at the mountains from Millhaven her whole life, had taken them for granted the way one takes all permanent things for granted, but riding into them was entirely different. The pines closed around the road and the air changed, colder and sharper and full of something that had no name in the vocabulary of valley life, and the creek that ran alongside the track was fast with snowmelt, and the sound of it was constant and clean. The trader, a laconic man named Greaves who had been making this run for 12 years, pointed out landmarks without comment and let the mountains do their own speaking, which they did. At a certain point on the road, in the early afternoon, a figure appeared ahead of them, coming down the slope on a big dark horse with the easy seat of a man for whom riding was simply movement. He was too far away to see his face, but Eleanor knew the shoulders and the way he sat and the way the horse moved under him, and she felt something happen in her chest that was not anything she needed a word for. He met them at the fork in the trail where the trader's route continued north and a smaller track went east toward the cabin, and he swung down from the horse before it had fully stopped in the way that strong men do, all controlled motion and no wasted effort. And he was there on the ground in front of her, taller even than she had carried him in memory, his face darker and more weathered from the winter, and his hair longer past his collar, and he looked at her with the amber eyes and the full attention and the expression of a man who is seeing what he came for. "You came," he said. I said I would, she said. He helped her down from the trader's wagon with both hands, steady and certain, and she was on the ground in the mountain air, and he was right in front of her, and his hands were still at her waist briefly, and then released her with the care he brought to everything. "Thank you, Greaves," he said, without looking away from her. "Right," said Greaves, and continued north. They rode up to the cabin. She understood, seeing it, why he had built it where he had. It sat on a bench of land above the valley floor, surrounded by pine on 3 sides and open on the 4th to a view that went for 40 miles, the whole sweep of the valley below and the mountains beyond, and the sky that at this elevation was a deeper blue than any sky she had seen. The cabin was solid and well made, the logs tight and the chinking clean, the covered porch running the full width of the front, a cord of wood stacked with geometric precision along the east wall, a kitchen garden on the south side showing the first green of spring. It was the home of a careful man who paid attention to what he was building. She stood on the porch and looked at 40 miles of Colorado, and she felt something very wide open up inside her that she had been carrying compressed for too long. "It is exactly what you described," she said. "I tried to be honest," he said, standing beside her. "You were," she said. "It is better than the description." He showed her everything with the honest pride of a man in the work of his hands. The fireplace he had built stone by stone, the sleeping loft, the root cellar, the spring behind the cabin, the trap lines he would show her properly when there was time. He cooked dinner, which was elk stew from the last of the winter's stores, with cornbread and dried apple preserves that a woman in Millhaven had sent up with Greaves in the fall, and the food tasted like everything good about living honestly. They sat on the porch after dinner in the last of the evening light, and the mountains went rose and gold and then gray, and then the stars came out in the numbers that they came out in at this elevation, which was more numbers than most people ever saw, a whole arithmetic of stars that reorganized the sense of scale. "Do you understand it better now?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I understand why it suits you." "Does it suit you?" he asked, and the question carried the weight of everything it was actually asking. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the reading and the silence and the view and the air and the cold and the cord of wood and the 40 miles of valley and the depth of winter and the loneliness of February. "I think it would suit me very well," she said, "with the right company." He turned to look at her. The stars were extraordinary. The air was cold and clean. "Eleanor," he said. "Callum," she said. He reached over in the starlight and took her hand, and he held it with the deliberateness and the warmth that characterized everything he did, and she held his back with the whole of her own certainty. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said, as she had said before. "I would like you to stay," he said, "not for a visit. I would like you to marry me. I would like—" He paused with the honesty of a man choosing words carefully. "I would like to build a life with you, on this mountain or wherever you would be willing to be, but I wanted to ask you here so you could say yes or no, knowing exactly what here is." The stars were doing what stars do at elevation in Colorado in May. She thought about a social hall and a broken chair, and a man who sat in it to test whether it would hold. She thought about 7 minutes of a slightly off-tempo waltz. She thought about a winter of letters and the February one that she had read 15 times. She thought about the way he looked at her without decoration, and the way he spoke to her without apology, and the way the world felt the right size when he was in it. "Yes," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and the toughness of him, and was therefore more affecting, and she felt it move through her like warmth through cold stone. "Yes," she said again, because it deserved saying twice. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in late June, in the church in Millhaven that never quite filled, which was on this occasion more than full, because Millhaven had by now fully invested in this story and had brought its best clothes to see the outcome. Eleanor wore a new dress, not ivory this time, but a warm cream color with blue trim that her mother and the seamstress had worked on together, made to fit her precisely as she was, with no apology in any of its proportions. It was the finest dress she had ever worn. Callum wore a proper suit that he had ordered from Halford with the careful economy of a man who bought good things infrequently and expected them to last, and his hair had been trimmed to a length that was still past his collar but no longer entirely wild, and he stood at the front of the church with the composed certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and why. And when Eleanor came down the aisle on her mother's arm, he watched her come with the amber eyes and the full attention, and his expression was the expression of a man who is seeing everything he wants. They said their vows with the plainness and the conviction of two people who meant every syllable. The minister asked if there was anyone present who objected to this union, which was traditional, and the church was briefly quiet. And then old Pete sneezed from the back pew, which everyone agreed was not an objection, and the minister married them. At the reception in the social hall, the same boards, the same lanterns, old Pete played his 7 songs in rotating order, and Mrs. Farnsworth, who had decided to forgive or at least to move on, contributed her best tablecloths. The food was extraordinary because the women of Millhaven had combined their efforts in a way that suggested they were collectively pleased with how this had concluded. Heck, Dunmore shook Callum's hand with more ceremony than was strictly required and said something that was as close to an apology as he was built to deliver, which Callum received with equanimity. Gerald Holt, who had in the intervening months met a neat and Denver-appropriate woman named Miss Pierce and was accordingly in much better spirits, came by briefly to offer his genuine congratulations, which Eleanor accepted with warmth. Her mother danced with old Pete during the 3rd song, which was the reel, and looked 10 years younger doing it. Eleanor and Callum danced the waltz. The same song, Pete's slightly off-tempo waltz, the same 3 count that had been the beginning of all of this, and they danced it now as married people with the full knowledge of what the other person was, and it was different and better, and all the more itself for being so. "Are you happy?" he asked her during the 2nd repetition. "Extraordinarily," she said. "Good," he said. He was smiling the full smile, the real one, the one with no delay. They spent the summer partly in Millhaven, partly at the cabin, arranging the combination of 2 lives into one. Eleanor's practical intelligence and her love of organization and her genuine willingness to learn what the mountain required of her turned out to be exactly what was needed, and she and Callum worked well together in the specific way of 2 people whose natures are complementary rather than competitive. He taught her trapping and tracking and the use of tools with the same patient care he brought to all instruction. She brought to the cabin the things it had lacked: the books, the correspondence that connected them to the world below, the organized stores that meant the pantry was never uncertain, the quality of domestic order that came not from obsession, but from genuine competence. She also brought her opinions, which remained as numerous and well-developed as they had always been, and which Callum met consistently with the earnest engagement of a man who found other people's well-argued views genuinely interesting rather than threatening, which was, Eleanor thought, rarer in a man than most men would like to admit. He brought her the 40 miles of valley from the porch, and the stars at elevation, and the sound of the spring in all seasons, and the particular quality of silence that had no equivalent anywhere below, and the safety of being with someone who was exactly as large as he was without apology or performance, which was its own kind of freedom. That first autumn together on the mountain was the best of Eleanor's life to date. The aspens turned in October in exactly the way he had described and had still managed to exceed, gold and trembling and absolutely excessive in the way that beauty in the Rocky Mountains tends to be. And she stood on the porch and looked at them with the full weight of having arrived somewhere that she intended to stay, and Callum came and stood beside her with his arms around her and his chin above her head, and they looked at the aspens together without needing to say anything. The winter was hard, as advertised, and better than it would have been alone, as hoped. They read to each other in the evenings by the fire, a practice that had started casually and become a fixed custom, the best hour of each day. They argued about books with the warmth of people who argue for the pleasure of it. They played cards, and Callum won more than he lost because he played cards with the same focused attention he brought to everything, which Eleanor had not anticipated and found deeply satisfying to beat on the occasions when she managed it. February was not lonely. Eleanor wrote to her mother twice a month, and her mother wrote back, and gradually the letters from Louise became longer and less formal and more themselves, and this felt like a gift that the mountain had given her, the distance that had made honesty easier between them. The following spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Callum on a morning in April when the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the first tentative shoots of new green were making themselves known along the creek. And she told him plainly and directly in the way she told him everything, and the expression that crossed his face was something she had not seen before and would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. A kind of stricken open wonder, the face of a man receiving something he had not let himself want for long enough that the wanting had gotten its own name in him somewhere private. He pulled her to him with both arms and held her with the controlled care that was characteristic of all his embraces, as though he was always conscious of the difference in their strengths and the importance of gentleness. And he held her for a long time in the April morning outside the cabin with the mountains going green around them. "Are you afraid?" she asked against his chest. A little," he said. "Are you?" "A little," she agreed. "Good," he said. "That seems right." They came down from the mountain in July, early enough to be in Millhaven well before the baby's expected arrival and to have proper access to Doc Halverson, who had been tending to Millhaven's births and ailments for 18 years and was not a man to be shaken by anything. Eleanor's mother was informed and transformed by the information. The volcanic quality that had characterized her response to the broken engagement was replaced by something equally energetic, but entirely in the opposite direction, a kind of furious, competent preparation that expressed itself as the most thorough preparation of baby equipment and instruction that Millhaven had likely seen. The baby came on a September morning, with the aspens just beginning to show the first warnings of gold on the lower slopes, and the air carrying the first true note of autumn. He was a boy, a solid, emphatic boy who arrived announcing himself loudly and immediately, dark-haired like his father, with the gray-green eyes of his mother, perfect in every dimension. They named him James. Callum held his son with the same controlled carefulness he brought to delicate things, which Eleanor recognized as the same hands that had held broken furniture and tested repaired joints and held her hands in the Colorado starlight, the hands of a man who understood that some things required gentleness precisely because they mattered, and his expression as he held James for the first time was the fullest expression she had ever seen on his face, not the controlled composure of a man managing his environment, but the open face of a man completely undone by something good. Her mother held the baby and cried in the way she had not cried about the wedding, which told Eleanor that this was the right crying, the kind that meant everything had arrived. Old Pete heard about the baby and showed up unannounced with a small carved horse that he had apparently made himself, which no one had known he could do, and which he delivered to Eleanor at the door with the gruff, affectionate embarrassment of a man performing an act of tenderness that fell outside his usual category. They stayed in Millhaven through October to let Eleanor and James settle, and then went back up the mountain before the passes closed, the three of them, with McAuliffe's help getting the additional supply load organized and Greaves making a special trading run to carry what they needed for a winter with a baby. The winter with James was different from all previous winters. It was more contained and more tiring and more full simultaneously. The cabin that had been ample for two became intimate for three, and the intimacy was not a diminishment but an intensification of everything. The fire was always lit. The books were still read in shorter installments, with One Ear on the sleeping baby in his cradle that Callum had made over the autumn, cut from pine and jointed with the same care he brought to all constructed things. Eleanor nursed James and watched the snow through the window and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost solemn, the feeling of a life assembled from its right materials. In the spring, Callum made a trip down to Millhaven for supplies and came back with two things: a package of new books from the Halford bookshop that Eleanor had ordered by letter, and a letter from Gerald Holt announcing his marriage to Miss Pierce, which Eleanor read with genuine pleasure and a completeness of feeling that told her the last unlocked door of the past was fully closed. The years built on each other with the substance of things made right. James grew into a boy of appetite and curiosity, and his father's directness, with a need to touch and test every physical thing he encountered, every piece of wood, every stone, every piece of equipment in the cabin or on the mountain trail, that Callum recognized with a warmth that was half memory. Eleanor taught him to read before he was 5, and to read well before he was 6, and to have opinions about what he read before he was 7, which was perhaps the greatest gift she gave him. When James was 3, a daughter arrived. They named her Margaret, after Eleanor's grandmother, who had agreed with doing things right. And where James was all physicality and forward motion, Margaret was all observation and precision, with a quality of watching the world and filing it accurately that was already, in a toddler, slightly unnerving and deeply promising. She had Callum's amber eyes and Eleanor's rounder face, and she regarded the world from very early with an expression of someone conducting ongoing research. The cabin was expanded that summer, Callum taking one wall out and rebuilding with a proper addition on the east side, a project that took the summer and was accomplished with the methodical satisfaction of a man building for time, thinking forward, making room for the life that was growing inside the walls. Eleanor helped where help was wanted and managed the household during the construction period with the organizational competence that had always been one of her strongest qualities, keeping 2 small children safe and out of the way of construction and fed and rested and engaged, which was no small project, and doing it with the humor and the patience of a woman who had found the work that suited her. Her mother came up the mountain that second summer, the first time she had made the trip, arriving with Greaves on the trading run and climbing the last mile on Callum's second horse with an expression of focused determination, and arriving at the cabin with the dust of the trail on her and her dignity completely intact. She stood on the porch and looked at the 40 miles of valley and said nothing for a full minute. "I understand," she said finally. "Do you?" Eleanor said. "Why you are here," her mother said. "Yes?" She looked around the porch, and the cabin, and the mountains, and the garden, and James playing near the woodstack, and Margaret in Eleanor's arms. "I understand completely." She stayed for 3 weeks, and by the end of the first week she had reorganized the root cellar to her satisfaction and established a daily schedule with the children that Callum followed without complaint, because Louise Beaumont's organizational intelligence was something he recognized from Eleanor and respected in both of them, and because it freed Eleanor for 3 mornings a week to simply sit on the porch with a book and the view, which was a luxury she had not previously allocated to herself and which he had been quietly trying to find a way to give her. Louise went back down the mountain at the end of 3 weeks and turned at the first bend of the trail and waved without looking back, which was how Eleanor knew her mother was more moved than she was showing, because her mother never waved at things she was only moderately moved by. She came back every summer after that. Millhaven grew through the years of the 1870s and into the 1880s, the way that Colorado towns grew in that era, with the railroad, first to Halford, and then with a spur that came within 7 miles of Millhaven itself, which brought new people and new commerce and the gradual replacement of some of the town's original character with something larger and less specifically itself. The social hall got a new floor. The general store expanded. A second doctor came, and Doc Halverson retired to a small house near the creek and could sometimes be found there in the afternoons on his porch with a pipe and a peaceful expression. Callum and Eleanor came to town more often as the years passed, partly because the children needed the school that Millhaven had established, and partly because the distance from the world was something that could be maintained at a level that served freedom rather than isolation, and they understood the difference clearly. They spent the winters on the mountain and the springs and summers partly in town as the children grew, maintaining a life between 2 territories that suited both of them. James, at 8, began accompanying Callum on the shorter trapline runs, learning the mountains with the same thoroughness and practical focus that Callum brought to everything, and the sight of them together on the trail, the man who had grown bigger and more himself with the years, the boy who had his jaw and his directness, was the sight that Eleanor returned to most often when she thought about what her life had accumulated. Margaret, at 6, was already reading at a level that alarmed and delighted her schoolteacher in equal measure, and had developed opinions about most subjects that she expressed with a precision and a completeness that made adults check whether they had been properly paying attention. Eleanor, at 33, Standing on her porch with the mountains at her back and the valley below, and the late September light doing what late September light does in Colorado, was a woman who had arrived at herself completely. She was large and full and strong, her hair still auburn with only the first threads of something lighter at the temples, her gray-green eyes clear and direct and fully lit. She was exactly the size she was, in body and in self, and the space she stood in was exactly the right size for her. Callum came up the path from the woodshed with a load of split timber over one shoulder, because he was the kind of man who split wood in late September to be sure the winter stores were right. And he came up the path with his dark hair past his collar, and his flannel shirt, and his forearms, and the amber eyes that found her on the porch and changed in the particular way they always changed when they found her specifically. And he set the timber down on the pile with the care of the habitual carpenter, and came up onto the porch and stood beside her and looked at the valley. "James wants to go to the upper trapline tomorrow," he said. "Is he ready for the upper trapline?" Eleanor said. "Almost," Callum said, with the honest precision of a man who did not tell his children they were ready before they were. "Another month if the weather holds." "It will hold," she said. "Until November, I think." He put his arm around her and she settled into his side the way she had learned over the years to settle, against the warmth of him and the solidity. And they stood on the porch of the cabin he had built and looked at the 40 miles of valley together. "Do you remember the social?" she said. He made a sound that was affirmative and amused. "Mrs. Farnsworth's chair," she said. "White oak," he said, "dried-out mortise joint." "You sat in it yourself," she said. "Someone had to test it," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with the amber eyes and the full attention that had never diminished in the years of their knowing each other, which was the quality she had loved first and loved most. The way he looked at her as though she were the most interesting thing in the room, in every room, always. "Thank you," she said. "For the chair?" he said. "For all of it," she said. "The chair and the waltz and the coffee and the letter in February and the mountain and all of it. For not looking away." He held her tighter for a moment with the controlled strength that was always there, always careful, always present. "You were the easiest person I ever decided anything about," he said. "I want you to know that. There was no difficulty in it. You were simply right." She felt this in the way of things that are said plainly and land plain, without any softening or elaboration needed, straight through to wherever such things go. Margaret came out onto the porch with a book and an expression of someone who had been reading indoors and had decided that outdoors was more promising, and she settled herself in the porch chair that Callum had made 2 winters ago, with a sureness and a smallness that were both deeply hers, and she opened her book and began reading with the focused serenity of a child who has found her natural habitat. James appeared around the corner of the cabin at a run, because James did most things at a run, with mud on his boots from somewhere that did not yet have a full explanation, and he skidded to a stop at the porch steps and looked up at his parents with the bright inquiring face that was his constant expression. "Papa," he said, "can we go to the upper trapline tomorrow?" "Ask me in a month," Callum said. James considered this with a patience that was a learned behavior rather than a natural inclination, and then said, "What if I ask you in 3 weeks?" "Then the answer will still be approximately a month," Callum said. James processed this. "That is not how negotiations work," he said. "It is how this one works," Callum said. James looked at Eleanor with the expression of a child appealing a verdict. She looked back with the expression of a mother who was not going to intervene, and was also slightly amused, and James recognized this expression well enough to know it was final, and he went back around the cabin at a run. Margaret, without looking up from her book, said, "He's going to ask again in 2 weeks." "I know," Callum said. The aspens caught the last of the afternoon sun and threw their gold light across the porch and the mountains and the 40 miles of valley below. And Eleanor Beaumont Reeve stood in the light with her husband and her daughter and the sound of her son somewhere around the corner of the cabin they lived in on the mountain they had made their home. And she felt the full weight and the full warmth of a life assembled honestly from its right parts, with the patience and the courage that honest assembly requires. There was a bird somewhere in the aspens doing something bright and repetitive. The creak was audible from the bench, the sound that was always there in all weathers, the sound that she had come to understand, was the mountain's way of confirming that it was still itself. She thought about a woman on the floor of a social hall in an ivory dress with the pieces of a chair around her. She thought about the door opening and light coming in. She thought about being helped to her feet with the steady, capable hands of a man who asked first if she was hurt and stated afterward, for anyone who needed to hear it, that the chair had broken under him too. She thought about how the smallest acts of careful attention can be the beginning of everything. The aspens released a shimmer of gold in the September breeze, thousands of leaves turning their pale sides to the light at once, and the mountain was full of it. And Eleanor Beaumont Reeve looked at her life and found it exactly the right size, at last, in every particular.